This is the second lecture of Section 2, entitled World War I, Industrial Warfare and America. Start going over some of these terms. We have war bonds. Now, these bonds are debt securities issued by a government to raise money for military operations during wartime. They are essentially loans from citizens to the government that have the promise of repayment with interest at a later date. Communism, a social, economic, and political ideology that aims to establish a stateless, classless society with common ownership of means of production, distribution, and exchange. In this system, resources are allocated based on need and private property, and social classes are eliminated. Essentially, it envisions a society where everyone shares the benefits of labor equally. There has never been, it should be noted, a valid communist country in the world. Not the USSR, not Cuba, not China, not Vietnam, not even North Korea. Again, all of these countries have a leadership, have a class system, which is complete defiance of the concept, the philosophy, the social design of communism. Since we're going to be talking about a world war, let's define a world war. A world war is a war involving 5 or more major powers on 3 or more continents. We're also going to talk about the issue related to neutrality. Now, we generally understand it as the state of not supporting or helping either side in a conflict or disagreement, absolute impartiality. However, we're going to run across, especially during World War I and in World War II, another concept that we could possibly call as military neutrality, which is the avoidance of military participation in a conflict while maintaining commercial relations that benefit a specific belligerent of that conflict. An apocalyptic event is a natural event or series of natural events that reverse all human advancement and return modern society to its primitive state. A mass extinction event is also a natural event or a series of natural events that result in the absolute destruction of human life. One thing that we're going to realize, especially by the end of this lecture, is after World War I, after the First World War, humanity will realize that these types of events are no longer restricted to natural occurrences and could very well be the result of human action. It's important to understand that throughout American history, Americans disliked the idea of a standing army. Many, since the time of George Washington, felt that it had the potential to threaten civil liberty in the United States, especially if it was controlled by a person of power. It was too expensive to maintain. People wanted to spend this kind of money on the economy. They didn't want to spend it on a bunch of individuals who were going to be playing war, not actually doing anything that would be beneficial for the country as a whole. And they saw any kind of army as unnecessary as the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans protected the country, especially as Mexico and Canada were not seen as threats. So then what stood in place of the United States Army? Now understand, we have an army, but it is on a very small scale. It was overshadowed by the United States Navy and Marine Corps, which maintained the bulk of American military operations. These operations supported maritime trade and tended to be, especially when we talk about the Navy, the first line of defense for the United States, based again on the fact that we are protected by the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. By the First World War, the United States Army was ranked 17th in the world, despite its elevated international industrial ranking. Up until World War II, what we're going to see is that active Army personnel served to train and lead new conscripts in times of a conflict. In the case of an acute conflict, the militias served as the primary defense force while the army prepared. Once the conflict ended, the army would be then drastically reduced, and the militia would then continue its place as part of the front line protection for the United States. Throughout the French Indian War, Revolutionary War, and the War of 1812, militias proved to be extremely unreliable. They were undertrained, under-disciplined, under-equipped, and under the control of very poor leadership. By the end of the Civil War, militias were replaced by federal and state reserves or guard units. Now, these tended to be much better organized. However, they were poorly funded, poorly equipped, and poorly trained. Army personnel of the United States experienced low pay, poor living conditions, and minimal national support. Most of their officers were trained as engineers rather than as combat professionals. Imagine a much larger scale of the Army Corps of Engineers. As a result, these officers maintained little combat training or experience. And when I talk about experience, it could be absolutely no experience whatsoever. The U.S. Army suffered from poor quality in its manning and in its equipment. The U.S. Army lacked access to the world's most advanced weapons during peacetime, and they lacked any actual wartime experience. By the time the U.S. Army deployed into an area of conflict, the troops were hastily gathered, trained, and hastily disciplined, posing a risk to both themselves and their fellow soldiers. At the same time, their leadership lacked the needed skills or understanding to lead the troops into combat effectively. The war technology and tactics that we see during the American Civil War changed little over 500 years. As so, I'm talking about the fact that during the War of 1812, the War of the American Revolution, the war related to the French Indian War, and the wars that had been fought over the previous 400 years, if not longer, in essence remained the same. This is seen in the fact that as the enemies marched towards each other, attempts were made to reduce the size of the two armies through swarms of arrows, staged gunfire, or cannons. Every single time, these battles ended with two armies clashing in close order combat. Victories relied on overwhelming number of troops, which we would refer to as wars of attrition, and rapid battlefield movements in extreme aggressive action. Skill with a firearm was not important as the bravery not to abandon one's position within the march towards the enemy. A soldier needed the courage to charge the enemy and then fight within the melee of the final stages of the battle. When I say this, what I'm talking about is arrows and the old muskets were highly inaccurate. So you did not necessarily shoot at the army, you shot towards your enemy. So there was not much skill needed because no matter how skilled you were, the equipment you were using just was not capable of accuracy. So again, it was that courage to continue to march towards your enemy, knowing that at any moment all the gunfire would end and everything would go quiet until that massive charge towards each other where everyone basically fought to the death in a center mass of the battlefield. Like arrows, muskets were intended to reduce the enemy's size before final contact. Though muskets and cannons were extremely deadly when they connected with their target, as military weapons, we need to keep in mind that they were pretty much unreliable. By 1865, the average area of reliable accuracy for a musket was about 60 yards at best. For any of you who have ever played paintball, this would kind of ring, or you would be able to understand this better. Like a paintball gun, the bore, the barrel of your weapon, we'll call it a weapon, is smooth, and you're firing out a round ball. Though there was a massive amount of pressure pushing that ball out, at a certain point, any imperfections within the round actually starts to act against the round. And we start to see that it starts to curve in various different directions, whether that be left, right, up, or down. For a paintball gun, it's usually about, I'd say, 20 yards before, or maybe even less than that, before you start seeing it kind of taking that alternate route that you really didn't want it to take. But again, in 1865, we're looking at about 60 yards at best that you could rely on any kind of accuracy. These guns, these muskets, were extremely heavy and difficult to aim, with most lacking any aiming marks whatsoever. They were difficult to load after every single shot. It was estimated that under perfect conditions, you might be able to fire 3 rounds in or within a minute. But again, these are perfect conditions. These aren't people shooting at you. It's not the adrenaline of the moment. And also, you're not, keep in mind, when you are fighting in a combat situation with a musket, you are, once you're reloading, allowing yourself to be open to be shot by someone else. I mean, it's not like you were going to hide someplace, reload, and then come back out. Because of the nature of warfare during that period, you really found yourself out in the middle of an open field. Now, the smoke discharge reduced the visibility on the battlefield, thus leading to the term the fog of war. And if you ever watch any videos, and I recommend hitting YouTube to kind of get an understanding, you'll see that when a musket is fired, there's a huge amount of smoke, white smoke that comes from the gunpowder. I want you to imagine an entire battlefield where this is happening with hundreds of individuals. And you can imagine at a certain point, the whole field is nothing but smoke, which means, again, your accuracy and you're able to focus on a target is reduced even greater. So, in essence, what we're talking about is that troops did not shoot at the enemy, they sent massive volleys towards the enemy. And again, it is because of these failures that you see the kind of combat that is taking place up to about the Civil War, where you have rows of individuals where basically the first row will shoot, they'll drop and load, the next row will shoot, they'll drop and load, and then so on and so on. Once everyone is reloaded, they march closer to each other, and then they start the process again. Again, this is not about accuracy. This is about volume. How much or how many rounds can we send across the field and hope to hit the other side? Again, this is why the tactics are very much like the previous use of arrows. And for the most part, cannons demanded a line of sight, just like the rifle, and suffered from a lot of the issues when it came to accuracy. So even though we have these, what would appear far more advanced weapons, they were still as cumbersome and, for the most part, I would say unreliable as the bow and arrows before them. Rifles of the early 1900s were far more deadly than the muskets that had preceded them. Rifles carried multiple rounds that allowed for rapid fire and easy reloading. They were far more accurate while maintaining a greater range. And also, they were smaller and easier to maintain than the muskets. We also see the introduction of the machine gun, which raised the firing rate from the muskets 3 rounds per minute at best to a deadly 450 to later 600 rounds per minute. And these were accurate up to about 100 yards. And it gave 2 men the killing ability of an entire company, 30 to 60 men from the Civil War. We also see the introduction of grenades, which allowed soldiers to throw handheld explosives capable of inflicting mass casualties to the enemy. In essence, Two soldiers of World War I with a machine gun, a rifle, and some grenades were capable of defeating a Civil War platoon of 40 soldiers or more. So kind of keep this in mind as we move forward. This is the drastic leap that has moved military operations, warfare, far farther than was anticipated at the point. And we're going to find, especially with World War I, that there's going to be a lot of misconceptions attached to these new weapons. Sticking with the cannon, we're going to find that as the advances in science and production advanced, so did the whole concept that revolved around cannons. And pretty soon we abandoned the concept of cannons and moved towards artillery. The range of artillery expanded threefold. Where I needed a line of sight, now I could fire a weapon in some cases anywhere from 4 to 5 miles away. The understanding of physics allowed for the accurate placement of rounds even though we're firing from several miles away. And each round had the potential now to kill and wound far more people. And you need to keep in mind that artillery became a weapon of terror, as one could not see the round. They could only hear the whistle before the impact. More so than ever, survival was a matter of chance or luck. One's skill as a soldier meant nothing in an artillery attack. With World War I, what we're seeing is a dawn of industrial warfare. The industrial revolutions of the 19th and 20th century changed warfare forever. It changed it on a scale that no one of the period could or even would understand until way too late into World War I. Military leaders remained locked in century-old tactics that had become obsolete with the advent of the new technology. Industry allowed for nations to produce massive arsenals rapidly, and trains and steamships allowed for the rapid mobilization of troops and equipment. The period to step back through negotiation from any kind of possible conflict or war was significantly reduced because of this new mode of not just production, but deployment of one's army. It was no longer solely the capability of a country's military, but also the effectiveness of its industrial system. Whoever built the most could expend more upon their enemy and gain the critical advantage. In addition to a nation's military forces, we need to keep in mind that an opposing nation's industry now also represented an extreme threat. Keep in mind, the general expectations of warfare changed with the industrial revolutions as each generation became far deadlier than the other. As I stated earlier, warfare had changed very slightly, even with the advent of gunpowder, for about 500 years. But when we start looking at the Industrial Revolution, the war technology of the First World War soundly defeated that of the Civil War or Revolutionary War. The war of technology of the Second World War massively, of course, crushed that of the First World War. The war technology of Vietnam vastly overwhelmed that of the Second World War, and this is how it has continued since the First Industrial Revolution. A country that technically falls 20 years behind its competitors may have suffered no disadvantage between the 1600s and maybe even 1890. But after 1900, they faced the risk of absolute defeat as the technology had surpassed their own. Technology is more important than a military size or aggressiveness at this point. And we'll kind of get into why that is the case. Got this great military technology that has revolutionized how we fight. But as I indicated before, there was a problem. And the problem is that the military leaders continue to plan their assaults with age-old aggressive tactics. The old romanticism that glamorized the single warrior was soon met with the horrifying reality of modern warfare. The courage of the soldier no longer determined the outcome of the battle. We need to keep in mind that the once glorious charge against the enemy was now proving to be suicidal. These new weapons introduced a new level of uncertainty to the equation and necessitated a complete change of tactics, which at first the generals and these war planners are not going to adopt. Now everyone required not just courage, but also technical combat skills. We're going to see, in addition to these other weapons, the introduction of aircraft, tanks, and other weapon systems that would only further the need to modify battlefield tactics, and in some cases were required to overcome the barriers that the new artillery, rifles, machine guns brought to the battlefield. Let's move from the technology and examine Europe of the early 1900s. We'll see that the Western world maintained five major powers in addition to the United States. These included England, France, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, along with the new country, Germany. All these countries maintained long and often violent histories with each other. Before World War I, Europe, ironically, had experienced half a century of relative peace. We'll see that the governments, even during this period of peace, used their militaries to demonstrate strength, but not necessarily to exert dominance. The military actions of the period were more a matter of grandstanding than actual aggression. Each side threatened military action only to compromise at the last minute in what could be called bluster and counter-bluster displays. Though we need to keep in mind that this bluster and counter-bluster display remained a very delicate process that relied upon specific conditions, as it often risked all-out war. Problem that we're going to find is with the advent of industrial warfare, as I stated earlier, that period of negotiation, that period of being able to back down is going to become far less available to these nations. So again, one small mistake during this bluster counter bluster display could result in war. So here we're going to see how the Swiss cheese model works. Now, the Swiss cheese model is the basic concept that if you get a bunch of slices of Swiss cheese and you line them just right, you're going to actually create a situation where the holes line up just right, allowing for things to happen. Here, the first slice is going to be the alliance system. Now, the alliance system was a mutual agreement between European power groups / blocs to assist each other in the case of unprovoked acts of aggression by another country. The first primary group that we're going to look at is a triple alliance, also known as the Central Powers, which consisted of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy. The Entente Continentale included France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. And later, as we were moving through World War I, the United States would join this, and they would become known as the Allies. Now, it's created a greater possibility for large-scale conflict because it reduced the amount of time to back away from the crisis, raised the chances of bluster turning into open conflict, and forced the nations to fight wars they may have chose to avoid in the past. As you have noticed, the Central Alliances are just that, the Central Alliances. They are surrounded by the Cordonel. This puts the Central Alliance at an extreme disadvantage. So it will fall upon German Field Marshal Alfred von Schieffelin to devise a war strategy should war occur. Now, it sought to address Germany's central location between its opponents, France and Russia. And his plans demanded rapid deployment and engagement within a very short time frame, which of course only added to that issue that we talked about earlier, having enough time to actually back down from a conflict. Now, the Schieffelin Plan triggered once Russia appeared to be mobilizing its troops, resulting in the invasion of Belgium and France. And then once Belgium and France were secured, they would then move on Russia. Now, this doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense, as I stated, that it was Russia that would be triggering the Schieffelin Plan. So let's take a look. The issue that Schieffelin was dealing with was the fact that it would take the Soviet Union, because of its size, and to some extent because of its poor leadership, a while to actually get the troops organized, armed, and transported to the German border, the German Austria-Hungary border. So the idea was they would have approximately 6 weeks where they would have a window of opportunity. And Schieffelin and many Germans believed that France was so inferior to them that an invasion would be, for the most part, a walk in the park for them. So the idea was to move through Belgium into France, and within a 5 week period, maybe even four, to move on to Paris, capture Paris, which would, for the most part, end any resistance in France, and then rapidly move across their country towards the Soviet, or at this point, Russia, in order to engage their troops as they were starting to move on to Germany, Austria, and Hungary. Again, the issue here, though, is he has to move fast. France has to fall within a very short period of time, which means there's no room to mess around. Once Russia even looks like they're going to mobilize, Germany can't negotiate. Germany can't play any games. They have to initiate their attack on France, which of course removes any possibility of further negotiations, because once they move into Belgium and France, they have initiated war. They have set the wheels into motion. So again, at this point in time, we're seeing that bluster counter bluster is no longer an applicable dance that they can maintain because of the Schieffelin Plan. What became known as the July Crisis, the Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated on June 28th of 1914 by rogue Serbian agents. Now, these agents were a part of Serbia's secret services known as the Hand. We should keep in mind that the government of Serbia was not aware of the plot against the Archduke. Despite this assassination, it should also be noted that the Archduke was not a person of great importance and that the Austrian government took no immediate action in response. As a matter of fact, they waited till after the holidays to actually address the situation. When they finally do address the situation, the neighboring countries responded based on their long-standing mutual histories. Germany chose to support Austria, as it felt obligated given their shared history. Russia chose to support Serbia to ensure its continued influence within the country, as it had in previous conflicts with Austria failed to really give the support Serbia needed. August of 1914, we see that the First World War is already well underway. President Woodrow Wilson issued a formal statement declaring that the United States would remain neutral in the conflict. Independent organizations and businesses within the U.S. supported both sides of the war. And this, of course, was based on their natural heritage or potential economic profits that might come from the alliances. The Central Powers and the Atelier Cordonel bombarded the U.S. with propaganda hoping to shift public support for their specific side. President Wilson strongly promoted American neutrality, and the war was not an American issue worthy of American lives, as many in the country believed, that mostly being led by Woodrow Wilson. Even in the beginning stages of World War I, we are going to see the huge difference between this industrial war and all wars that preceded. In the First World War's Battle of the Frontiers, both sides suffered 664,191 casualties over a period of 30 days. In 30 days of the American Civil War, which included the battles of Brandy Station, Winchester, and Gettysburg, we see 57,227 casualties were recorded. The single battle of World War I saw 93% of an increase in casualties from the three battles that took place during the American Civil War. 1.5 million people were lost in the first 6 months of the First World War. The total estimated deaths of the 7-Year War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, was around 1.5 million people, equaling that of the first 6 months of World War I. The total number of deaths in the 5 years of the American Civil War was 620,000, which was only 41% of the total lost in the first 6 months of World War I. So please understand as we're moving forward, especially as we get to World War II, which is going to dwarf some of these numbers. Industrial warfare has changed the face of military operations completely. There is no way that you can compare on any realistic basis World War I and the wars that follow to that came before, because we are in essence talking about two completely different worlds. Several weeks after Schieffelin's planned deadline, Germany was still only 50 miles from Paris. Their supply line could not support the expanding offensive, and for the most part, they stalled where they were at. With the invasion of Belgium, we see that England entered into the war, thus strengthening France's defenses, and they were able to start to push the Germans back several miles. However, by September of 1914, the first trenches start to form and expand as each side attempted to flank their enemy. By the end of 1914, the trenches stretched nearly 500 miles across northern France. And we'll see that for the next several years, troops stationed along the front fight hunger, disease, shelling, snipers, and at times each other. Also note, despite regular attacks from both sides, these lines remained relatively close to their original positions, neither going forward nor backwards more than sometimes a mile, only to be taken again and then pushed back forward a mile. And I would really encourage you, take a look at these photos and you can gain an understanding of what it was like to live in these trenches, not just for a little while, but we're talking for the early years of the war. Sometimes, again, the enemy was not necessarily the man on the other side. The enemy was actually the conditions you lived in: disease, hunger, trench condition known as trench foot, where your feet could get so wet and they would stay wet for so long that would actually cause your feet to bleed. These were some of the conditions that they ended up having to deal with. And again, remember, these lines did not move back or forth by much, so this is pretty much where things sat for quite a long time. Elsewhere, the German Navy's use of unrestricted submarine warfare resulted in the death of Americans sailing through war zones along the European shores. One such case, the sinking of the HMS Lusitania, resulted in the death of 128 Americans. While the losses did not immediately lead to the United States' involvement in World War One, they do play a role in paving the way for the US's eventual declaration of war against Germany in 1917. Despite the American Pledge of Neutrality, the US kind of early on starts supplying Britain and France throughout the war through industry, money, and other forms of support. The millions made in profit, as well as the potential for more revenue after the war through the repayment of U.S. loans, was enticing for the president. The U.S. began walking a fine line between being a participant and remaining neutral. And again, this is where we get into that military neutrality. The United States is not committing troops to this war, but on all other sides, they are supplying arms, they are supplying money and other support to France and England. Wilson's inability to remain entirely neutral motivated the Germans to start to target more American ships. February 3rd of 1917, President Wilson announced that he had severed diplomatic relations with Germany. He avoided the declaration of war by stating that unless provided with ample proof that Germany intended to attack the United States, military actions would not be required. We'll see that President Wilson continued to assure the American public that the United States would not enter the war in Europe. And understand that he is really putting a lot of weight into his promise to the United States that the United States will, one, remain neutral, and two, will remain isolated from the conflicts in Europe. Wilson stated that he was open to the possibility of negotiation if Germany refrained from attacking U.S. shipping. Germany understood that Wilson might commit to war against them, and it might turn the war against them should the United States join into the conflict. But we need to keep in mind, on top of the president's rhetoric to the American people, we still had the extreme poor state of the American military, which also provided the Germans with an extended period before the U.S. could even think about entering into the war. In keeping the United States out of the war, German leaders believed that they could distract the United States by misinformation and manipulation. The Germans desired to reignite the U.S. conflict with Mexico and Japan, or at least create the illusion of a potential conflict. They thought that using the poor history between the three countries, the illusion of Mexico and Japan joining forces against the United States might cause Wilson to focus on the Pacific and not necessarily focus any real attention on the Atlantic Ocean. It maintained the potential to overwhelm an already weak United States military with a potential two-front conflict. And if this was the case, then the United States would be focused or would be forced to focus on one it would see as the immediate threat in the Pacific. And as such, would allow the Germans more time to end the war in Europe and greatly in their favor. What became known as a Zimmermann telegram. British intelligence intercepted a telegram sent by German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico City. It instructed the ambassador to ask the Mexican government for support through attacks upon the United States. Germany promised the Mexican government the territory it had lost in the Mexican-American War, including Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, the British will forward the intercepted telegram to President Wilson on February 24th of 1917, but seeking to pressure Wilson into action, the British then strategically leaked the telegram to the U.S. media, knowing that it would provoke a strong reaction, which it obviously did. And it significantly influenced the United States' decision to enter into World War I on the side of the Allies. We're going to find that it wasn't just the Zimmermann telegram that is going to motivate Wilson. In the face of famine, economic depression, and centuries of social struggle, the rise of communism in Russia threatened the established power structure. On March 15th of 1917, Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated his throne as the People's Revolution grew. It would be the provisional government against the Bolsheviks, the communists, led by Vladimir Lenin, that fought to gain control over the collapsing monarchy. The chaos in Russia only worked in the favor of Germany, as the Russians were no longer a significant threat to the German Empire, which left France and England on the verge of collapse. The radical concept of communism worried the Western nations, including the United States, as it countered the capitalistic economic model. And such a threat added to the pressure on Wilson to abandon his isolationism and commit U.S. troops to the war, not just against Germany, but also possibly against Russia. With Russia out of the war, Germany increased its attacks on American shipping, thus placing U.S. investments in extreme jeopardy. President Wilson was forced to abandon neutrality and declare war on Germany. We see this take place on April 2nd of 1917, when Wilson requested a declaration of war against Germany before a joint session of Congress, and then days later this was followed by a declaration of war against Austria-Hungary. Congress supported both of these measures. However, even though he had won Congress, Wilson faced a significant problem, as he had spent the past several years promising the American people neutrality and isolationism. As we have seen before, Wilson's answer was to declare the war as a moral imperative. Wilson's approach, though, will fail to convince the country as a whole and would create turmoil and, in some cases, even a constitutional crisis. Let's look at some of the rhetoric that Wilson's going to use. And I really want you to keep this in mind as we move forward, because these are kind of what I was talking about before in the previous lecture, that there's kind of a two-sided aspect to Wilson. So the first one, the world must be made safe for democracy. Its peace must be planted upon the tested foundations of political liberty. The next one, we are but one of the champions of the rights of mankind. We shall be satisfied when those rights have been made as secure as the faith and the freedom of nations can make them. The history of liberty is a history of limitations of government power, not the increase of it. This is one that I really want you to pay attention to. Along with, the ear of the leader must ring with the voices of the people. President Wilson is going to rely upon the Committee of Public Information in order to shape public opinion in support of the war effort. And remember, they need to sell a 100-degree turn in American policy after years of Wilson's strong anti-war rhetoric, and they need to do it quickly in order to meet Europe's crisis. Along the way, we're going to see that the Committee on Public Information is going to vilify both American Germans and anyone who tended to oppose the United States entering into the war. We're going to see that this push for conformity challenged the civil liberties of most Americans. Additionally, the Committee on Public Information is going to have to address an even larger problem, which is that the United States Army maintained only 200,000 active duty servicemen at this point, using the Guard, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. The Army was still relegated to a very small part of the United States military doctrine. Its goal was, in a time of crisis, which now World War I is, was to gather up as many conscripts as possible, arm them, train them, and then deploy them. However, maybe during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Civil War, this was a lot easier. In the Industrial War, what we're going to find out is that in order to get them at least to some kind of equal footing, or even a capable footing to be of any value in World War I, they're going to need at least 1 year to not only build, but to train and equip these men. It will be the United States Navy, along with the Marine Corps, that are going to initially take many of the operations in order to get the United States into Europe. However, they are only limited to sea operations. It's really the Army that's going to play the major role here. So to get these numbers up first, we need the Selective Service Act, which established the military draft for World War I. And we will see that by June of 1917, 10 million men have registered for the draft. However, just because you have them registered does not mean that we're at the point to go to war, because we're still going to need, as I said before, a full year to train, arm, and deploy these men into active combat roles. Anti-war and anti-draft demonstrations spread throughout the country. The women's suffrage leaders and African Americans questioned Wilson's war for democracy. Many Americans were denied access to the democratic process. German Americans were torn between their loyalties to America and their sympathies for Germany. Poor Americans questioned their forced participation in a war 3,000 miles away. A phrase that started with the Confederacy and then moved on to the Union soldiers during the American Civil War returned. It was known as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Wilson saw challenges to his policies as a threat to America itself and reinstated the Espionage Act. Now, this act prohibited interference with military operations or recruitment, insubordination in the military, and the support for U.S. enemies. The act targeted many immigrants, German Americans, and anti-war leaders, and led to the creation of, yes, American internment camps. And we need to keep in mind, remember what he had said in his earlier quotes. To some extent, if not to an absolute effect or extent, he's actually violating his own claims, his own moral push for America going into the war. So let's take a look at these two posters. They're kind of going against each other. So we have the first one, Someone Talked. Now the artist is R. Ho and Company. This was a company that put out posters for the United States government. And we see here that because one person talked, a United States ship was sunk by the enemy. And understand, this is not all that unheard of. Yes, there are times, as it would also be said later on, that loose lips would sink ships. And why do we keep focusing on ships? Well, keep in mind, in order for us to supply our troops in Europe, we need ships. We need to be able to move all of that equipment, all of those men, and all of those additional supplies across the Atlantic Ocean. And with the U-boats out there, if they get information about American shipment, then they can attack it. So that's the one side of making sure that Americans do not risk the security of our operations, more specifically our military personnel. However, at the same time, where do we draw the line where it goes beyond our freedom of speech, our ability, or our liberties for which Wilson was saying that we needed to protect? This again gets into that whole complicated area. Where do you draw the line in a time of war? To some extent, what we're going to see is Wilson pretty much goes way too far in his attempt to ensure that everyone is on the same page, on his page. And this is predominantly where we're going to see a lot of the problems that Wilson is going to have when it comes to maintaining the support of the American people. Additional acts were passed, such as the Sedition Acts, which forbade the use of disloyal, profane, or abusive language about the United States government, its flag, or its armed forces. The Committee on Public Information encouraged Americans to act against fellow citizens with differing opinions and forced many to buy war bonds. Groups that challenged the government's actions were hit the hardest. Union leaders were imprisoned. Families are encouraged to turn in their family members. Communities encouraged to monitor people they suspected of being disloyal. German communities were targeted by government supported vigilante groups, and many were jailed or sent to camps without trial or the right of appeal. And again, go back to those quotes that we did of Wilson. Are these policies violating what he stated was the reason, the foundation for America fighting World War One? I'd like you to take a moment and ask yourself, did the war solidify U.S. commitment to what it would call American values? Or did the war prompt the U.S. to abandon its values? And is there a middle ground? Is there a place during a period of conflict such as a world war that we should be required or should be willing to give up certain rights in order to protect the safety of our country? But should it be at the expense of our rights? Again, there may not be a right or wrong answer for this. This is something for you to ask yourself and kind of contemplate yourself. Not only did the people had to adjust to war, but also the industries had to adjust to a new wartime economy. For this, we see the creation of the War Industries Board, or the WIB, which formed in 1917. And this federal agency reorganized industry for maximum efficiency and productivity. We're going to see the installment of the Food and Fuel Act. In August of 1917, Congress authorized regulation of the distribution of food and fuel between military demands and civilian needs. The Committee on Public Information encouraged the public to support the new policies that limited their access to resources and everyday freedoms. And understand, we've never experienced this. The last time we saw anything close to this would have been World War II, maybe even the Korean War. But starting with Vietnam and there forward, the government has always tried their very best not to inconvenience the American people in any way. But understand, there was a period of time where the American people were expected, and most of the time were very willing, to make sacrifices in order to help the war needs of their country. We're going to see that during this period, the military expanded its budget by borrowing more money. Thus, the federal debt increased from a mere $1 billion in 1915 to $20 billion by 1920. The war provided American businesses with expanded profits as capital expenditures increased from 600 million in 1915 to about 2.5 billion by 1918. Farm produce rose from 9.8 billion in 1914 to 21.3 billion by 1918. Large corporations grew from the need for more organized production under a centralized leadership. And although this was supposed to be temporary, the lessons learned by these corporations had long-lasting post-war consequences. We're going to see that the expanding economy, wartime draft demands, and a decline in European immigration created a huge labor shortage throughout the United States. Organized labor found leverage as it became indispensable to the country's war effort. We're going to see that the National War Labor Board was created to prevent strikes that would disrupt production in the war industries. To do this, they opened negotiations with employees to improve working conditions and wages. And in exchange for not striking, the unions were able to add more than 1 million more members in a period of 2 years. With a ever increasing void of working men, we're going to see that women are now being called upon to fill in that gap. Keep in mind that before the war, 8 million women were members of the country's labor force. Their income and opportunities remained significantly limited compared to those of their male counterparts. With more predominantly white men going to war, women and other minority groups were needed to fill the labor void. Now, this, of course, was providing these groups with the chance to enter higher paying industrial jobs, which were once denied to them. We're going to see that American women were also allowed to serve in the military for the first time, with 16,000 being deployed into Europe. But let's keep in mind that these were non combat roles. The expansion of women in the workplace had effects on their social status and behaviors as women began to openly practice the behaviors that were only tolerated among men. This included smoking, drinking, and sexual promiscuity. Numerous, I would say a large portion of America's conservative minded citizens demanded an end to these new lifestyles. But by doing so, this meant that they were obstructing the war effort that they supported. Kind of placed them in a catch-22 situation. As you can see here from these photos, women are critical to the war effort. We have women working in the factories. In this case, the two photos in the middle look like women who are working with artillery shells. We have women who are driving the ambulances in Europe, and we also have women that are working in the mines, which are critical for gaining the metals that are going to be used in numerous item or uh, weapon systems that are going to be given to the soldiers and deployed throughout Europe. As women became increasingly critical to the war effort, many advocates became even more passionate about women's suffrage or the right to vote. Alice Paul led protests outside the White House that used Wilson's propaganda against him. Wilson responded by encouraging assaults on the protesters by bystanders and by the police. We see some of the same tactics that were used against the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory worker strikes in New York. While in prison for the second time, Alice and her supporters went on a hunger strike. And through a very dangerous, painful, and degrading process, the women were force fed through tubes 3 times a day. The bad publicity created by the newspaper articles proved too much for Wilson. In exchange for Paul's termination of the hunger strike, Wilson promised to support women's suffrage publicly, but only after the war's end. As the U.S. started to build its military, many Southerners feared that allowing blacks to defend the country might inspire a renewed push for their inclusion in the American democratic process, maybe even at gunpoint. Although encouraged to fight in the war, African Americans were not provided the same support as white troops. Black Americans needed to fund their own training and supplies, and despite their participation in the war, they were barred from military parades. To ensure their participation in the war and avoid turning Americans against them, African American units were required to avoid responding to white hatred. And note that they were under constant harassment from both white civilians and military personnel. Yet, many continued their quest to defend American democracy 3,000 miles from their family and friends. August 23rd of 1917, the Houston riot, or the Camp Logan mutiny, marked a violent clash between black soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 24th Infantry Regiment, and white civilians and police in Houston, Texas. The incident resulted in the death of 19 people, including 4 civilians, 5 policemen, and 10 soldiers. Following the riot, 110 soldiers were convicted in Army court-martials. The rapid trials left the black soldiers without any legal representation as required by law and military regulation. 19 would be executed in the largest mass execution of American soldiers by the U.S. Army. Note that in November of 2023, the Army officially recognized the injustice of their trials and set aside the convictions of the 110 soldiers. As the war progressed and the opportunities opened, African Americans began to abandon the South to find work in the North, spurred by economic opportunities that were created by the First World War. It became known as the Great Migration. In the North, the migrants were forced into specific communities as many whites refused to open their neighborhoods. The St. Louis riot of July of 1917 lasted for nearly a week and left 9 whites and hundreds of African Americans dead. This resulted from a mob of Anglo Americans upset about the increase in employment of black people in the city's industrial plants and resulting jobs shortages. The property damages were estimated at almost 400,000. More than 6,000 black civilians, fearing for their lives, fled the city. And amid the violence, President Wilson took no action to protect the African Americans or their communities. For those African Americans that actually made it to Europe, we'll see that many of them experienced continued racism, as only 1 in 5 black servicemen would actually see combat. Most would be assigned remedial labor such as cooks, laundrymen, stevedores, and other type of non-combat, non-infantry jobs. Not wanting to deal with the problems of race relations, the U.S. military transferred African Americans into French commands, where the black soldiers actually experienced better treatment and far greater respect. The 369th Harlem Hellfighters received French awards for their services to become the first decorated U.S. combat unit in the war. Numerous black Americans elected to remain in France after the war because of their experiences. They tended to find that Europe was fascinated by American jazz culture, and it allowed them to create new lives far different from those of the soldiers who returned home. So, in these two pictures, what do you see that would not have been possible in the United States? What does this say for Black American soldiers in Europe? And note, Europe still promoted negative racial stereotypes during the First and Second World Wars, but they were still willing to give Africans, migrant or immigrants within their countries, far more respect than what we were seeing in the United States, despite all of Wilson's rhetoric, despite all the things that America stated it was supposed to be promoting. We actually see that African Americans were gaining more respect out of the country than within. In what we could call war-driven social change, unlike African Americans and Asians, the U.S. military viewed all other minorities as white. Men of different cultures served with each other. 42 languages were spoken, which were often creating problems with communications throughout the military. Americans grew more understanding and tolerant of various European and Latin American cultures. Even social class lines blurred as the rich, who tended to be officers, served alongside the American poor, who tended to be enlisted in combat situations. And understand, when you face combat, there is a certain drop of all dislike and distrust because these are the people that you know will have your back, or you hope will have their back. And suddenly, what you may have gone into the war with these preconceived notions tend to disappear when you actually get to see the person in the light of conflict. Now, the war also affected the way the government approached public health, as venereal disease rose to 6% among draftees, creating drains on the military. To combat these losses, the U.S. government launched a campaign against risky behaviors. and it explored medical and legal options to stop the spread of these diseases. And again, this shows that the United States government is starting to become far more involved in the personal lives of Americans. And again, this is where we see the theme of war-driven social change. It's not necessarily that we want these changes, but because of the conflict, because of the obligations and the desire to get past this conflict, we are seeing that Americans, again, do not want to make the change, but find themselves having to make these changes. And once the changes take place, it's very difficult to go back to the way things once were. Back in Russia, the Bolsheviks, representing the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, intensified their push to govern Russia. During the October Revolution of 1917, under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin, we're going to see that the Bolsheviks ousted the Russian provisional government. In December of 1917, Russia and the Central Powers signed an armistice ending fighting among Germany's Eastern Front. The anti-capitalism rhetoric of Lenin led Wilson to refuse the recognition of the new Communist Party. In the summer of 1918, Wilson, along with France and England, committed troops to suppress the rise of the communists, which ended unsuccessfully in 1919. Throughout the 20th century, Russia and the Western nations would be in opposition to each other as each sought to spread its influence throughout the world. And it's interesting, if not critical, to keep in mind that the American relationship with Russia, later the Soviet Union, only then to return back to the country of Russia, has always been very tense. And we see that here with our opening involvement with the new Soviet Union being one where we actually invade or attempt to invade the country. On January 8th of 1918, Wilson outlined a policy of free trade, open agreements, democracy, and self-determination in response to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. He's going to call for a diplomatic end to the war through the withdrawal of the Central Powers from all occupied territories. In the post-war world, President Wilson called for an international disarmament and the redrawing of Europe's borders along ethnic lines. Wilson pushed for the formation of the League of Nations to afford mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. As with his other speeches concerning the rights of humans and the morality of democracy, Wilson did not include all nations under his 14 points. Many of the human rights he described would not apply to the weaker nations outside America and Europe. Those freedoms and rights of those countries remained at the discretion of the Western nations that held control over those countries. After a year of building, training, and equipping its army, the U.S. began to deploy its troops. Despite the year of prep, the U.S. tended to play a secondary role to the far more combat experienced Allied commands, and they failed to gain the complete trust of the Europeans initially. By May 28th of 1918, the first American engagement with German troops in Europe took place at the Battle of Tegnig. Though an Allied victory, the American forces suffered over 1,600 casualties in the battle, which brought concern and criticism from home. Throughout the war, despite the increase in American industrial military production, the U.S. was compelled to utilize the equipment of the European allies. Now, the war will end within 6 months of the first U.S. battle in Europe, as Germany, exhausted and close to collapse internally, saw the addition of fresh American troops as just one more reason to abandon the war, especially as they sought to avoid an invasion of its nation by enemy troops. Over a period of 2 days, starting on November 9th of 1918, Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II and Austria's Charles I abdicated their thrones as widespread discontent among its civilians, the strain on its economy, and the loss of their allied forced German generals to seek an armistice before Allied troops entered Germany. On November 11th, Germany signed the armistice at Champagne, France. The celebration of Veterans Day as we know it today marks this event. On June 28th of 1919, the war between Germany and the Allied powers officially ended. With this, Germany was forced to accept all responsibility for the war. It was left with the War Guilt Clause, Article 231, which compelled Germany to disarm, make substantial territorial concessions, and pay reparations to the Allied powers. Predominantly, this would apply to England and France. It is to be noted that the United States Senate did not ratify this treaty despite public support for it. Despite the end of the war, the chaos continued as the deadly influenza pandemic of 1918 to 1920 infected 500 million people across the world. The conditions of war and the returning troops, which affected both civilians and military personnel, proved conducive to the spread of the influenza, and it resulted in the deaths of 50 to 100 million, or 3 to 5% of the world's population. The US government changed the medical system in order to anticipate future outbreaks. And we see this in the growth of hospital versus home visiting doctors and the implementation of new regulations. Social and political resistance to the way the government handled the crisis was very similar to that of the 2020 COVID-19 crisis. And ironically, the use of masks was a significant point of contention during the Spanish influenza. With the war's end, the women who had filled the male dominated jobs were forced out as men returned home. However, their contributions and experience caused a cultural shift, which created more acceptance for the expanded roles of women in the workforce and in society as a whole. The changes in attitude towards women and their capabilities opened the door for the country to re examine a woman's right to vote. Honoring his agreement with Alice Paul, Wilson convinced Congress to pass an amendment providing women the right to vote. On August of 1920, Alice Paul and the National Women's Party achieved their goal as the last state voted to ratify the 19th Amendment. This amendment stated that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex. The returning soldiers hoped to put the war behind them and return to where their lives had left off. This transition to a peacetime economy overwhelmed the job market and threatened the jobs of the minority workers. Anger grew as high unemployment and the working class discontent seemed to go unabated. A series of white supremacist attacks, race riots, and lynchings across the United States marked the rise of the Red Summer of 1919. These incidents predominantly targeted African American communities and veterans returning from World War I. Many white Americans feared the growing economic and social mobility of Black Americans and resorted to violence to maintain the existing racial hierarchy. As seen previously, the violence was often fueled by rumors and a sensationalized press. After the armistice, American workers were no longer willing to make sacrifices that had been required of them during the wartime economy. Employers motivated by high profits sought to undermine the unions. We'll see that by 1919, approximately 4 million workers were engaged in around 3,600 strikes nationwide. Using the post-war patriotic fervor, numerous companies and corporations, along with politicians, used the Red Scare to suppress the unions and labor opposition. We'll see labor unions, never before associated with a specific ideology, were now accused of furthering communism. The false perception that labor movements were communist in nature created a with us or against us attitude among many, And this allowed major corporations to gain the support that was once lost among politicians. Keep in mind that the Espionage and Sedition Acts continued after the war to suppress dissent and arrest individuals deemed subversive with the threat of communism. The Red Scare led to widespread arrests, detentions, and deportations, often without due process, infringing on civil liberties of those targeted. The fear of being labeled a radical or communist led many to self-censor and avoid expressing dissenting opinions, creating a climate of fear and intimidation throughout the country. The Red Scare ultimately subsided in the early 1920s, but it left a lasting impact on American society and politics, highlighting the tensions between national security, civil liberties, and political ideologies. As seen with the progressive era of the late 1800s, corporations continued to view labor with contempt, especially as unions demanded that their growing profits be shared among the employees. Corporations responded with what was called welfare capitalism, a paternalistic system that emphasized management's responsibility for an employee's well-being as an alternative to labor unions. It was expected that the workers would trust that these corporations would be looking out for their best interests. And this again came despite nearly 100 years of history that pointed in the other direction. We also see that corporations wanted to push for what was known as open shops, or the right to maintain the ability to prevent the hiring of union members. In the face of a local economic downturn, white Oklahomans grew upset over their prosperous African American neighbors. On May 31st of 1921, groups of whites, including some appointed as sheriff deputies, attacked the black community of Tulsa's Greenwood district, which was also known as Black Wall Street. The violence lasted over a period of 2 days as mobs of whites burned and looted the Greenwood district, destroying over 35 square blocks as well as causing over 26 million in damage. The exact number of casualties remains uncertain, but the estimates indicate 300 deaths of mostly African Americans. More than 800 people were injured and approximately 6,000 black residents were detained. And we know to a certain degree that the carnage left 10,000 people homeless. During this period, we're also going to see the initiation of prohibition. The 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16th of 1919, thus banning the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors. The Volstead Act was enacted in 1919 to provide enforcement for that amendment. However, the 18th Amendment maintained numerous legal loopholes which created issues for its enforcement. The increased crime weakened American initial support of prohibition. The increase in illegal production and sale of liquor, known as bootlegging, required a larger number of law enforcement officials. Illegal drinking spots, also known as speakeasies, were filled with people, including politicians, lawmakers, and police officers who had been sworn to uphold the amendment. We're also going to see that the U.S. saw a rise in gang violence as the demand for illegal liquor promised large profits in the underground market. So just for fun, let's take a look at prohibition. And let's start off with a question. What national support has its origins in bootlegging and moonshiners? I'll give you some hints. It required fast vehicles, vehicles that could outrun the far less engineered police cars. The faster your vehicle, the better chance you could not only outrun the police, but also get your moonshine to the people you needed over a long distance. And just for those of you who haven't figured it out, that national support would be NASCAR. Now, the 18th Amendment banned the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol, as I stated before. However, it should be noted that it did not ban the consumption of alcohol. We're going to see that the black market made $3 billion per year during Prohibition. As people sought ways to make the often harsh tasting bootleg liquor more palatable, we'll see that they developed new cocktail recipes and techniques that we still use to this day. We're going to see that drugstores continued selling alcohol as medicine. The Prohibition Party would use the mascot of a camel. Anti-alcohol groups claimed that wine was made with cockroaches or alcohol could cause your brain to catch on fire. We're going to see that Prohibition turned public sentiment around when it came to tipping. So for those of you who are in the service economy, thank Prohibition for getting you your tips. On October 2nd of 1919, President Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke and did not run for re-election. The Republican Warren G. Harding became the country's new president, and he was initially seen as one of the most popular U.S. presidents as he appeared sensitive to minority communities and women. This ended, though, with the Teapot Dome scandal in 1921 and 22, which devastated Harding's administration. It involved the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, who was bribed to grant leases specifically in the Teapot Dome area of Wyoming and Elk Hills, California, to oilmen Harry Sinclair and Edward Doheny. Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in August of 1923, and following his death, the details of the scandal became widely known. Left Harding as one of the least effective presidents due to the widespread corruption that plagued his administration. During the 1920s, the term isolationism came to represent the country's desire to avoid the chaos that swept across post-First World War Europe and Asia. This policy was displayed in the rejection of the League of Nations, the imposition of high tariffs, and restrictive immigration policies. Some of these policies included the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and the Immigration Act of 1924, which significantly reduced immigration in order to limit foreign influence and preserve, quote unquote, a more harmonious population. Despite its isolationist tendencies, the United States continued to engage in extensive trade with Europe and Asia. The two great oceans served as a protective barrier, which required a strong naval force to protect the American homeland and its territories. Consequently, though, the need for a large army seemed unnecessary and a burden upon the U.S. economy. And as we talked about before, this was an attitude that continued since, or had originated with, the Revolutionary War. With this in mind, the National Defense Act of 1920, or the CON Act, updated the National Defense Act of 1916 to reorganize the United States Army. The legislation established that the Army of the United States would be an organization of three components, with a regular army of 175,000, a National Guard of 450,000, and an organized reserve set by the states. Congress later reduced the allocated manning limits and significantly cut officer and enlisted pay. As the centuries before, the American practice of minimizing the military after a conflict returned. Those who returned from war were forgotten, and the needs of the active duty soldiers were sidelined, focused on the growing economy. The United States began to rapidly lose the advancements that it had gained in World War I. And by 1933, the United States again ranked 17th among the nations in active Army strength. We should keep in mind that it was not just the Army that would pay a price during this period of downsizing. The Washington Naval Conference was a 1922 conference focused on naval disarmament and addressing security concerns in East Asia and the Pacific. It was attended by Japan, China, France, Britain, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands, along with Portugal. But we should note that the Soviet Union, Russia, was not invited despite its military presence in the region. The conference represented the first international conference held in the United States and the first arms control conference in the history of the world. It sought to limit the military powers of all industrial nations to better preserve the peace, limited naval construction, pushed for respecting territorial integrity, and promoted further open trade in China. Ironically, though, it enabled the Japanese Empire, who had far less than any other nation at the time, to increase its naval power while remaining within the rules of the conflict. The sheer destructive nature of the First World War caused leaders to contemplate a new existential threat. They realized that humans were the greatest threat to civilization. Also, technology was not only a blessing, but also a significant threat too. Nature, or God, no longer were the most significant fear as humanity became its own worst enemy. The United States would benefit from the war in numerous ways, but its post-war policies proved detrimental as the world approached the Second World War, especially in its continued downsizing of military assets to prioritize its economy. The loans made during the war to allied nations brought great economic rewards to the United States, but it would later play a key role in the Great Depression. We're also going to see that the problems of the progressive era seem to linger despite the successes of the progressive movement. These included racism, labor problems, and women's rights.